To start with, I want to mention that SASE would like to thank this year's virtual organizers, that is, organizations that supported the online organization of this conference, that is the KHK, Center for Global Cooperation, in collaboration with the IAQ and the DIFIS. These are European organizations. So in this session, the presenters will be Rosemary Batt from Cornell University, Jayati Ghosh from University of Massachusetts-Amherst, Nadia Araujo Guimarães from University of Sao Paulo, and Klammer from University of Duisberg-Essen in Germany. I'm Diane-Gabrielle Tremblay. I'm from University of Quebec and Canada, and I will be chairing this session. Each of the presenters will speak for 10 minutes, and then we'll have a general discussion and we'll have a Q&A. Just a few rules that we would like to put forward. We would like, of course, panelists to speak as clearly and loudly as possible because we're going to be recording the sessions and they can be used afterwards for teaching or whatever. Also, if for the audience members, if you can mute your microphones, because we know that all sorts of things happen, like dogs barking or whatever. So that would be good. However, it's nice if you can have your cameras on, especially during the discussion. I think that would be appreciated. If you want to put questions in the chat box, that's fine, as concerns the session and what we're discussing here. Also for the questions afterwards, I'm going to try to follow that, but I only have my a laptop, so either you put the hand in the reaction box, you put that up, or just visually, I think I can manage that as well. So to start, just a short presentation of the panel. I think we all know that the COVID-19 has kind of recentered our attention on a certain range of occupations, on different forms of labor also, including unpaid and informal labor. That was, of course, studied previously, but really came to the forefront of the attention in the last year and a half or so. Also, certain sectors of work like domestic work, care work, health, food production, package delivery, a certain number of sectors that have really undergone a lot of change. And I think we can all say that they were undervalued previously in terms of formalization, in terms of irregularity, in terms of pay, in terms of social protection. There are a lot of women, of course, working in these sectors, not only women, but a good number of women in many of those sectors. So the idea in this panel is to assess the extent to which the COVID-19 pandemic has maybe created an opportunity for reevaluating what is essential labor, how it is and how it should be compensated. Also how those who perform such work can actually improve their voice, and possibly we can manage to give them, or for them to have better protections and better working conditions in recognition of what we have said over the last year, that is that their labor is essential. So that's kind of the general thrust of the panel and the discussion that will follow. So the first presenter is Rose Batt. She is Alice Cook Professor of Women and Work and Chair also of the Department of Human Resources Studies at the Industrial and Labor Relations School at Cornell University. She is also the Editor-in-Chief of the Industrial and Labor Relations Review. Her research focuses on globalization and restructuring of service industries and its impact on low-wage workers. Her recent publications cover the impact of financialization on employment in the health service sector, on labor and employment conditions, and also the prospects for social unionism and healthcare. So I turn it to you, Rose.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for organizing this session. I'm really excited to be here, and I'll get right in. I have my little timer going so that hopefully I won't go over my allotted time. So what I want to do is focus on two dimensions or two levels at which I think COVID is operating in the US. One is at the general level of the economy, political discourse, and policy change, and the other is at industry-specific levels, where we see some variation across industries depending on the extent of the pandemic effects, but also union power. So at both levels, I want to emphasize that we need to analyze the current and future opportunities, not only in terms of COVID and its impact, but the broader institutional environment in the US. And here we see that COVID dynamics are intersecting with already existing movements, particularly the racial justice movement that just exploded last summer with the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others, and had historical momentum already through Black Lives Matter. And then second, the Fight for 15, the massive social movement that gave basically 23 million workers in the US a raise, a substantial raise to $14, $15 an hour. And that builds on the immigrants' rights movement and Black Lives Matter. So we're not starting from scratch, but these movements are the platform which then COVID acted upon, if you will. So at the general level, political level first, and then I'll move to the sectoral level. The US federalist context means that there are policy changes occurring at the local, the state, and the federal level. So many of you from other countries are looking at probably the stalemate in Congress, or the pro-Biden, the pro-union, pro-Biden administration. But there's a lot more going on bubbling up at the local level that is important to pay attention to. So in terms of the political discourse, clearly the Biden administration is the most pro-union, pro-worker of any in recent history, certainly including Obama and Clinton and other Democrats. Clear statements from the beginning about tackling corporate power, supporting the $15 minimum wage, supporting organizing rights and collective bargaining. And clearly, the left movements have pushed the administration in that direction. So that platform has been really important in pushing that pro-labor agenda. He's made a lot of really good pro-labor appointees. And already launched different executive orders. We're overturning all of the Trump retrograde executive orders and established a task force headed by Kamala Harris to examine every single agency to see where there are opportunities to pass executive orders that would support or promote union organizing. So there's a lot going on that's positive there. At that federal level for the first time in a long time. And, you know, the COVID pandemic is a lever that the administration is using to push that agenda forward. Also in the court of public opinion, the public discourse has probably never been as positive as it is now for labor. There's general disgust over employer neglect of the safety precautions for essential workers. There's 60% of Americans support unions now, higher than in decades, and almost 60% support what is called the PRO Act, which is a major effort on labor reform. So that's some of the good news at the general level. Now, if we move to the sectoral level, there are kind of 3 points I want to emphasize. The first is simply that COVID has created massive labor market shortages, particularly in these essential jobs. You know, healthcare workers just are quitting. I mean, it's enough already. And retail workers, restaurant workers do not want to come back because they have felt so exposed. And so there are massive labor shortages in the low wage industries. And this is just forcing employers to pay higher wages. Now, whether they will continue over a longer period, we'll see. But in restaurants, for example, they're offering signing bonuses. They're voluntarily moving to $15 an hour. This is for low wage, you know, fast food workers. They're kind of desperate. They're also really worried and scared. So you see these websites, employers saying, oh my God, union organizing on steroids. And so there is a worry in the employer community, and labor shortage is pushing up the bottom. And the other thing they're doing, though, is they are substituting technology for labor. So you see, restaurant kiosks and the talk of robots and things. So there's some labor substitution, but I don't think that's going to get too far in consumer-facing industries. Okay. Then there are two other points I want to make. One is about workers in non-union industries, and then the other is about workers in unionized industries. So in the non-union industries, we've seen unprecedented mobilizations. Again, I'm sorry. Based on these working conditions, workers doing all sorts of wildcat strikes, gig workers, Instacart workers, grocery workers, Whole Foods workers, people just walking off the job, Amazon warehouse workers, over protesting coronavirus safety violations. So this has been a mobilizing an issue that people feel so strongly about it. People have never been involved in labor actions before, saying enough is enough. So that's interesting, positive. In the unionized industries, we're seeing unprecedented labor activity, strike activity before the pandemic. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics only captures strikes that are 1,000 workers or more. So if you think about small workplaces, that's leaving out a lot. Despite this, we had very few strikes in 2017 and going back. In 2018 and 2019, we had an average of 450,000 workers on strike in each of those years. So, and particularly teachers, and teachers are professionals, but they're paid horrible wages. So if you're talking about the southern states or western states, they are frontline essential workers, really, and mostly women, of course, not receiving good pay. And there is also unprecedented organizing. Zoom is a new organizing tool, not only among teachers, people in right to work states, a lot, so more than we've seen. And just an example in healthcare, there's absolutely unprecedented organizing, and large numbers of campaigns, especially nurses. The Militant National Nurses Union is one of the most active and important ones, really out on the front line with political agenda as well as organizing agenda. So to wrap up, so we've had higher minimum wage due to labor shortages, as well as the fight for 15. We have much more general public support for unions and workers' rights. Thousands who have never been involved in mobilizations have gotten involved and are building long-term capacity. There's a permanent increase in unionization on white-collar workers, some of those essential, like teachers, grad students, frontline people. There's increased support for unions and strikes that have successfully gotten hazard pay, paid sick days, and protective equipment. Now, on the negative side, there's little union organizing in the traditional manufacturing or blue collar and a lot of the low wage services. So there have been wildcat strikes, but union organizing that's likely to stick in retail or restaurants or related is not very likely. There's a lot of cynicism that the billionaire salaries and the corporations have made out like bandits in the pandemic. They've made billions, and workers still don't have paid sick leave in the United States. There's also political action stymied due to Republican power in the national government so far, as well as, all right, my bell went off, and I have one more line. But so there's still control at the national level with Republicans, as well as at the state level, where the Republicans control a lot of state legislatures. And I haven't mentioned this, but throughout, there have been far worse outcomes for women. So in the essential industries, if you think about women have dropped out of the labor market, we don't know how many will be coming back in order to care for children. And so there are real some disadvantages and disproportionate outcomes that hit people of color and women. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I'm having a little issue with my computer, just at the wrong time because everything was fine. But now it's hiding what I was supposed to be looking at. Try to get this open again, or I'll get it from somewhere else. Hang on just a minute so I can present our next presenter correctly. I think I have this. I've got all the equipment here, the phone, okay. So I'll go on to the next presenter, Jayati Ghosh. She was previously chairperson of the Center for Economic Studies and Planning at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, India. And since January 2021, she is professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts-Amherst in the US. She has been very engaged in consulting for international organizations, and she currently serves on the UN High-Level Advisory Board on Economic and Social Affairs. Her extensive publications broadly cover alternative theories on economic development, and she has also focused on informal work in the Global South from a gender perspective. So I leave it to you.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. So let me look at the international dimensions of this, the post-COVID world. And as you mentioned in the very beginning, it's not post-COVID for most of the world. And unfortunately, most of the world is not even re-evaluating the essentials. And I regret to say that even in countries like the US, where currently I'm based, the essentials are being re-evaluated perhaps within their own economy. But as far as the global economic and political interaction is occurring, it is very much the same. It's essentially Trumpian, and it's essentially inward looking, and it aggravates the global inequalities that have made the COVID scenario so very desperate in large parts of the world. So let me just reiterate what I think is essential. I mean, I believe, like relatively few economists, that economies have to serve societies and people rather than the other way around. And that really means that you have to examine how we do economic policy. I'm currently a member of the WHO Council for Economics for the Health of All. And our aim in this council is to actually think first of how do we get a healthy society, and then what do we need? What kind of economic structures, institutions, strategies, and processes do we need to get to that healthy society? Which is really reversing how all governments across the world currently think of it. And that implies massive changes in many, many aspects. We have to think about the economics that will deliver human security, capabilities, reduce inequality, increase employment, provide security of livelihood. And really that means several critical areas. It means that you have to actually expand public spending very, very significantly. The United States recognizes that and has been doing that. You have to actually ensure that innovation occurs in ways that benefit society. What do I mean? I mean that currently we have intellectual property rights that give monopoly control to companies, even when they are massively and dominantly public funded. The current situation of intellectual property rights with regard to vaccines and other life-saving equipment for COVID-19 reiterates this. 90% of this research is publicly funded and hugely subsidized. And yet these are a relatively small number of companies globally that control production and supply and are limiting access to the rest of the world. We have to think of financial market rules and the ways in which management of external debt is currently inhibiting the ability of many governments to spend in ways that are required. Just to give you an example, I think, we just heard a very interesting discussion of what's been happening in the United States. The fiscal stimulus, the additional spending of the governments up to March 2021, that is not even counting the things that are currently being discussed in the US Congress, was approximately $25,000 per head for a year. $25,000 per capita additionally spent in the US. What was the average additional spending in developing countries? Well, in the low-income countries over this period, $2 per head. I just want to keep those numbers, remind you, $25,000 and $2. That's the kind of difference we're talking about. And the absence of the recognition of this among the leaders of the so-called world, the G7 and so on, I think is a real indication of how the pandemic has exposed many inequalities, of course, within our societies and economies, but it has deeply and fundamentally exposed the absence of international solidarity. And I will come back to this point because I think it really points to our inability to face any of the major existential challenges facing humanity, like climate change. But let me just highlight a couple of the ways in which this absence of solidarity has played out. The most obvious right now in the context of the pandemic is the attitude to vaccines. Not only did the rich country governments basically hand over the rights of knowledge about these vaccines to a few companies, thereby denying developing countries the knowledge that would enable greater global supply. But they are still resisting the waiver of intellectual property rights in the WTO that would provide the minimum legal condition for other countries to try and expand this production. The United States has agreed to stop opposing this waiver, but it has still not pushed its own companies to provide this knowledge to other producers in the developing world. The Biden administration can make Johnson & Johnson provide this technology to Merck for US supply. It does not tell Johnson & Johnson or any other company, Pfizer, Moderna, etc., which they funded hugely, to provide this technology to other companies across the world to increase the supply. Really, this means that we know that 75% of all vaccines have been administered in just 10 countries. No points for guessing which ones those are. I think everyone knows. And so everyone where I am situated at the moment is happily talking about how, it's all open and we can start again, and post-COVID, all of these terms are being bandied about freely, whereas in the rest of the world, they're facing wave after wave of massively debilitating, destructive recurrence of this disease, which is actually destroying lives, livelihoods, economies, human security altogether. The developed countries didn't just prevent additional supply, they grabbed vaccines, right? I mean, the United States ordered 4 times what it needs for its population. Canada ordered 11 times what it needs for its population. I could go on, but you get the general idea. And now they are hoarding these. The United States is sitting on 80 million doses of AstraZeneca vaccines, which it will never use. And so on and so forth. The G7 has offered to give, I think it is 470 million doses by the end of 2021. They are sitting on a stockpile of something like 5 times that amount. Why? In addition, they are providing vaccines as charity. Several African countries have got vaccines delivered to them 2 weeks before the expiry date, which really means you have to throw them away, because the very process of vaccination requires a minimum of 2 or 3 weeks logistically to get the vaccines across to people. So here's one example, just one example of the lack of international solidarity. To move on to one very obvious low-hanging fruit, which could have been very easily done, the proposals for a global tax deal. There have been moves afoot and demands made by civil society organizations and many economists to have a global tax deal that will prevent multinational companies from moving their profits around to low tax jurisdictions. This is denying the whole world something like $500 to $800 billion per year in unpaid taxes. The IMF estimate 500 billion, some others estimate 800 billion. So a lot of money is actually being denied to governments across the world, including developing countries for whom often corporate taxes are the main source of revenue. Now, it's easy to fix this. You could have a rule whereby every country taxes a multinational in a unitary fashion, according to its share of sales, employment, and assets. It says, these are your global profits. Here's my share of those. I will tax you at my tax rate according to this. Of course, we need a minimum tax rate for that. We have been proposing 25%. Biden administration said 21%. The G7 has gone for 15%, which is a tax rate paid in tax havens like Ireland and the Netherlands. In other words, it's gone for such a low rate that developing countries would actually lose if that maximum becomes a minimum. And furthermore, this idea of unitary taxation, it has watered it down to such an extent that it is only going to be charged on 20% of the excess profits, whatever that means, of companies that already earn more than 10% profit, which brings it down to only about 100 companies. Amazon, for example, is exempt from this already. And I'm sure all the others will find creative ways of avoiding paying these taxes by changing their profit rates, depending on what they pretend are their costs in different jurisdictions. This, again, is not necessary. This denies everyone. It denies citizens in the developed world. And of course, it hugely denies people in the developing world. While insisting on this very, very watered down strategy, the Biden administration is demanding that developing countries give up their unilateral rights to tax digital companies. It is fighting in the WTO cases against countries that do this. It is saying that you have to subject yourself to arbitration that we will decide for returns that are not even crumbs from a table. Now, this is, of course, I would argue, stupidity within a country because you're only benefiting large corporations, you're not benefiting the people, but it is also hugely unjust and unfair and shows a significant America first or G7 first attitude to the rest of the world. The next issue is that of sovereign debts. Many countries today, some of the poorest countries in the world and a bunch of emerging market countries are paying more in debt in terms of their debt service than they are on health, even in the course of this pandemic. Forget about other kinds of welfare and compensation and care economy spending. They are actually spending more on debt service. Yet the rules for global sovereign debt relief are so rigid and so unjust that governments do not get the kinds of assistance that are routinely granted to companies in advanced economies. So all the major corporates in the US and in Europe are getting benefits that are denied to sovereign debtors in the developing world, because we don't have a global system of debt restructuring. And guess which countries are preventing that from happening? Again, no prizes for guessing. Finally, I just want to reiterate that, yes, people there's a lot of inequality in the US as well. There is inadequate relief to some of the weakest sections and so on. But I think people, now that I'm here in the US, I realize how even the most progressive people don't realize the extent of deprivation in the developing world. 70% of workers in the developing world are informal. They have no legal or social protection. Most of them got close to no compensation during a period of 1.5 years of no incomes, no livelihoods, disastrous collapses in wages and so on. Countries are facing starvation, and we have a looming food crisis in large parts of the world as global food prices go up as well. So essentially what I'm saying is that this is a situation in which we need urgent international solidarity. There's a complete absence of it. And the lack of this is actually deeply worrying, because this is just the beginning of major existential challenges we will face, like climate change. And if we don't have solidarity for something as obvious as a pandemic, we're not going to get it for more serious challenges.
Thank you very much. So we've had two excellent presentations, and I'm sure everybody has questions and comments, but we're going to go on with the last two presentations. Now, the third presentation is by Nadia Araujo Guimarães. She is professor she's professor of sociology of labor at the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil, and she's a full member of the Brazilian Academy of Sciences. Previously, she held guest professorships at Princeton University in the US, also at l'École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, amongst other places. She's currently also associated with, her research is focused on gender and racial inequalities in labor markets and at the workplace, and her recent publications cover circuits of care and care work in Latin America. So over to you, Nadia.
Thank you very much, and congratulations for SASE's decision to welcome reflections on the way in which pandemic challenges key features in our society. So going fast for the 10 minutes, I'll try to contribute to our discussion, proposing just 3 topics. The first one is a reflection on pandemic itself as a device. I would say that pandemic showed, and I'll take Brazilian case in mind, but not only the Brazilian case, pandemic actually showed that we are all vulnerable, and that we are all involved in different plots, in different networks of care, and that we all depend on it. In this way, I think it's a good idea to think pandemic as a kind of device. If we think in terms of care work, pandemic is a device that brought to light, providing visibility to a different series of work that used to remain invisible. Overall, from its nature of discrete know-how performed by women who needed to manage mostly emotions, aspects, not only competence in their daily work. But I think that pandemic maybe can be thought also as a device of visibility, since it generalized and it rooted in everyday life, what I could refer as a grammar of care. That grammar of care took our society from the beginning of pandemic and grow. On the other hand, it's interesting that pandemic had also some cognitive effects, even on our academic disputes. I think that it dislocated the so-called debate between the dependence paradigm and the paradigm of vulnerability. So pandemic showed as a device that there is no special certain groups where care refers to, or privileged care beneficiaries. Care is not only an issue for disabled, for elders, for minor children, for people with special needs, etc. Care is a question for all of us in certain point of life. So I think this first point is very important to think about impact. The second point is a reflection on the relations between care and morality. Because I think the pandemic also forced the field of care, the studies of care, to reflect on a subject that has been carefully explored by social economists, but that has not been entangled with our reflections on the domain of care. It's the theme of valuation. In fact, valuation around care issues in terms of the grammar of care, which I referred before, emerged in daily life. And it emerged by means of a very interesting disjunctives, such as we have to live a life, or we have to take care of oneself or the others. What is important? It's health or economy. In my country, the disjunctive was crucially mobilized by the negativist government of Jair Bolsonaro, for instance. This underlines the relevance of different regimes of evaluation with their instance of legitimacy inside the field of the daily question of care during pandemics. So they became evident in our society, for instance, a set of expert competitions in public spheres, epidemiologists versus economists in my country had huge and sometimes difficult dialogues. And in the competition also among corresponding expert discourses. This brings light to this new effect of care as an important regime of morality that does not only anchor individual choices, but it is also an artifact, a device that is present in public space. For instance, the centrality of notions such as social infrastructure of care exemplifies this effect. Besides the demand for national integrated systems of care that came to the scene in various countries in Latin America, I think put emphasis on this second point. Thirdly, and finally, I would suggest that it could be interesting to discuss in four underdeveloped, less developed global South countries, whatever we call them, the connection between care, poverty, and its circuits in different ways of signifying the word of care became quite important during pandemic and shall be taken into account after the applause. In Brazil, for example, there has been a especially intense move on women's integration in the labor market from the 70s on. But this move gave place in the last year, from 2019 on, to an important reflux on women's participation rates. In recent research that tried to ask the women, but why they moved to outside the labor market, the most important response is due to care obligation. So the circumstance of pandemic put a stop in this important movement of integration of women in the labor market. A second important point is that racial inequalities experienced an important growth related to the changes in this recent period. I think not only in terms of the unequal risk of contamination, we know that contamination in Brazilian large cities is much more frequent in poor areas than in rich areas. Since the beginning of the problem of COVID was through middle-class neighborhoods, very fast it became a problem for poor communities, but it's overwork related to care responsibility. We are used to refer the difficulties, the experience of middle-class women doing in-home work, but the problem is much more serious. Recent research in the Brazilian case show among Black and poor families that had to accumulate care responsibilities related to their own families, to the extensive family, to the neighbors, to their networks. A second important point in this third dimension I suggest for discussion is that in the Brazilian case, and I would suggest that this is not only the case of Brazil, the commodification of care, which has been an important aspect of the care discussion in our literature, recent literature. This commodification of care in my country came side by side with an internalization of different types of work care at home, in the house. Commodification do not came intensively related to externalization of care responsibilities, although there was externalization in some extent, especially for those more affordable. But commodification came with an internalization of different types of care work in the homes, But what is interesting in the Brazilian case is that with democratization, you can take 1988 constitution, there was a suggestive contradiction. We improved the rights on eligibility of care, rights for elders, for children, for disabled people, but we shrinked rights when it concerned for care providers. So even though we had a democratic constitution in '88, which assured rights for workers, there was a paragraph that created the exclusion of those rights for domestic employees. And it took from '88 to 2015 and a strong fight for the domestic employees, which are very important in Brazil, as we can see, for instance, in the last ILO international study on care regimes. Those employees, domestic employees, had no rights as the other workers in Brazil until 2015. And the care workers had no rights at all until now, since their quest for rights was obstructed by the President Jair Bolsonaro in 2019. So they were mostly informal. They have weak collective organizations. So pandemia implied extreme exploitation conditions, either in households, but also in long-term facilities. It is related with contamination and also death. And if we take the public policies initiatives, care workers for a long time, for at least 8 months in 2020, were not considered essential workers and even had not preference for vaccines. So we had incredible scenes in the Brazilian case of elders being brought to the vaccination with the care worker. The elder get the vaccine, but not the care worker. And even the applause, which is in the title of our session, which had its place in Brazil, the applause to health workers, also came, and we have been documenting this in the country, with the intensification of discrimination and aggressions, either on public transportation, on the streets, etc. Just to finish, there has been also in my country, and I think it is a trait that we shared with other South countries, scarce experience of social protection. But in the Brazilian case, there was a backlash on the short period of expansion of rights during Lula and Dilma's period. There has been a backlash from the labor reform in 2017, and mostly from 2019 on during this negativist government. So no specific care policies have been put into place during the pandemic. And specific consequences of confination, have been present. For instance, in the Brazilian case, the confination and the closing of the schools is not only a problem for middle-class women that had to deal with their children at home and work and make homeworks at the same time, but the closing of schools implied for poor students hungry, because children, Brazilian children, not only get knowledge, but also get food in Brazilian schools. So this is a complex network of characteristics linking care, poverty, and circuits of care provision in a country like Brazil. What is interesting, and put a light to think after the applause, we have been observing that networks and popular forms of associationism related to care has been booming recently. I don't know if we can think it as a positive or a negative result, because it implies that there is no strong presence of the state. There is no strong presence of regular forms of collective associations and quest for rights, because underlying this booming of the associationism, there is the idea that we just have ourselves. So in sum, I think that there is an important challenge we have to face after the applause, is that how can we maintain care issues, care work as central aspects, and after the applause? How can we translate the centrality care got during the pandemic for the society as a device, a new grammar? How can we translate it on rights and rules, which is quite important in countries in the global south as Brazil? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So we go on to our last presentation before we open up for questions and discussion. So the last presenter is Ute Klammer. She is Professor of Social Policy at the University of Duisberg-Essen in Germany. And she is also director of two of the three institutes that are actually sponsoring the SASE meetings this year. So thank you very much for this. The Institute for Work Skills and Training, AIQ, and the German Institute for Interdisciplinary Social Policy Research, DIFIS. In her research, she focuses on European and comparative welfare states, also on poverty and income distribution and pension reform. She is also especially focused on gender inequalities, with some recent publications and public comments on how the coronavirus is actually widening the gender gap. So over to you, Ute. Microphone.
Okay. Thank you very much, Diane-Gabrielle, and hello to everybody. Yeah, I can only agree to what some of the earlier speakers said of our panel. We are not yet behind the pandemic. We are still in the middle of the pandemic, but it's after 1.5 years, the interim assessment is certainly a mixed one, I would say. On the one hand, it has been widely discussed already. The corona pandemic has raised many old and new distribution issues. This is true globally, but also within a developed industrialized country and welfare state like my own, Germany. Overall, the unequal distribution of income, wealth, but also education, gainful employment, and other things has undoubtedly grown significantly. Children of poor families or recent immigrants have been particularly set back in Germany, according to what we know so far. We diagnose problematic developments in the apprenticeship market and regressions in the labor market integration of refugees. With regard to the distribution of family tasks, the fragility of women's employment became apparent. There was a major debate prompted by researchers from gender studies on the disproportionate burden of women in the pandemic. For example, to my knowledge, American scientists first pointed out that the productivity of female scientists, as measured by journal article submissions, declined more than that of male scientists in the pandemic. One reason was clearly home office. Home office can hardly function when individuals must simultaneously perform homeschooling and care for children at home. Against this background, a heated debate was initiated in Germany by female scientists and politicians on the danger of a retraditionalization of gender relations during the pandemic. Obviously, this was more pronounced in Germany than in other Western countries. This was made clear to me by an interview. A French journalist who was very irritated about the debate interviewed me. And I think it seems to be related to the fragility of many women's involvement in the workforce against the background of still effective norms of the male family breadwinner in Germany. But there are also many positive aspects. For one thing, the great value of a functioning welfare state became clear, especially in the phases of the lockdown, in which policymakers reacted surprisingly courageously and quickly with packages of measures and assistance, from healthcare to short-time work to corona assistance for the self-employed or family. Overall, the labor market and the healthcare sector functioned quite well. The instrument of short-term work in particular has buffered income losses and prevented layoffs in many particularly hard-hit sectors. In the first lockdown last year, we had in March, April, we had more than 10 million people on short-time work. At the peak, in one moment, more than 6 million people with compensated short-time works, 3 times more than in the financial crisis of 2008. On the other hand, the gaps in the security system became more visible, in particular with regard to small self-employed and cultural workers. Many of them have lost their livelihoods. But given the panel after the title of the panel, after the applause, I want to focus now in the following minutes on the sector that has received the public applause in many countries, the healthcare workers, healthcare, elderly care, and I want to inform you about what happened here and discuss this a little bit. An interesting development in Germany is a very recent law that has only been passed in June, the 2nd of June, which says that in the future, all nursing staff in the elderly care sector has to be paid according to collective agreements. This is the main aim of this new care reform. To achieve this, from September 2022, only care facilities that pay their nursing and care staff according to the collective wage agreements will be permitted to provide care or to bill it with the care insurance, the public care insurance scheme. It is a new political attempt to establish an acceptable minimum wage for this system-relevant industry via the instrument of tariff loyalty, after another attempt has failed in February. As soon as the plans became clear, there was, unsurprisingly, criticism that the state should not interfere in the autonomy of collective bargaining. But you have to know that collective bargaining, it is very important for a central historical component of the German industrial relations system, but it doesn't work out well anymore because we have the collective bargaining coverage has gone down so much. Now we only have a quarter of companies, 27%, still covered by collective agreements, and about 47% of employees in Western Germany and 57% of employees in Eastern Germany are not covered by collective agreements anymore. So linking pay to tariff agreements is really a progress, will be a progress for this sector. The care sector is particularly characterized by a fragmented collective bargaining landscape in Germany and particularly diverse negotiation areas. One reason is that for a long time nursing professions were female dominated. There were second earner professions in the household, and many nurses have never gone to the street to fight for their rights and good pay. So the market alone will not fix the problem of low pay in nursing and caregiving. So the corona pandemic certainly has helped to make this more visible and to show the value of social services activities. We can see this quite clearly in Germany. So one question is, what would be a fair wage in this sector? And this is quite difficult to find out. What does equal pay for work of equal value mean in such a sector of such as care and health work? Although equal pay for work of equal value, as we all know, is an ILO core labor standard since the 50s. What equivalent work means can be measured by an index we developed, a comparable worth index, that where we tried to show the requirements for certain jobs, more than 90 occupational groups, and the stresses connected to certain jobs. And this index shows quite clearly that nurses and qualified care workers should be paid as engineers when you really want to pay them equal pay for equal work of equal value. So in fact, engineers in Germany earn on average 90% more than care workers. And this shows how big the differences are at the moment. However, this new index is not legally a benchmark for legally compliant pay. In Germany, the principle of equal pay for equal work or work of equal value only applies to one employer or one area of collective agreement, not on the national level. But you can see what equal pay of equal value would mean if you take it serious. So it therefore, in my view, it makes sense for policymakers to help to strengthen the collective bargaining system by linking the award of public contracts to compliance with collective bargaining agreements. Interestingly, to secure this, some parties now want to introduce a federal law on wage compliance for the public sector in their election programs for the new legislative period. So what do we learn from Corona so far? In any case, Corona is magnifying, or COVID is a magnifying glass in many fields that has made pre-existing problems even clearer. But it can also help to implement overdue political regulations. And I'm a mix of pessimistic and optimistic about that. We can clearly see that it is an accelerator, for example, in digitalization. And our conference here, the SASE conference, shows this also. The working world will no longer be the same after the experience with home office during the pandemic, for example. And this touches upon many of the big issues we have to face in future years, the big Ds. Digitalization, demographics, decarbonization, and also diversity. So I think the question we have to tackle is whether there will anything as a new normal, or whether we will have many new normals. And well, we will have the opportunity now to discuss this, but in any case, I see our task as scientists as closely monitoring the developments in dialogue with policymakers here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. 4 excellent presentations. I think they really set the scene for a good discussion. So I can see pretty much everybody on the screen. So if you want to use the hand system, that's fine. Or if you want to turn your cameras on and just indicate that you want to speak, that would be great. So the floor is open. Also, even the presenters, if you want to have questions between yourselves, that's fine as well, as you wish. For the moment, I don't see anybody putting forward a question. Okay, Karen. Also, I can mention that Karen is the person who organized this session on this theme. So thanks, Karen. I think we have a very good discussion starting on this.
Yeah, thank you to all of you. I found each of the presentations a very valuable contribution to the question of whether COVID-19 is a crisis that will set us back or put us ahead. And reacting first of all to Jayati's international perspective, I mean, this made me really reflect too on the issue of globalization or deglobalization. And, you know, the last financial crisis imposed a regime of austerity on the world. And the rhetoric now is that they learned from that and won't be doing that anymore. We heard last night in a keynote by Kente Kelenos exactly the opposite prediction, that in fact the IMF is still up to the kinds of structural reforms that will liberalize health systems and increase inequalities throughout the world. And I'm wondering how this is discussed. You mentioned, Jayati, that you're also in this high-level WHO commission. If policies like co-payments and, you know, contributions in health systems will be imposed as ways of lending or forgiving in some parts of decks, I mean, we could say that COVID is going to greatly increase inequalities, which of course makes no sense because the pandemic is global. If we don't solve it everywhere, we won't solve it in the global north either. We'll just be confronted with more and more mutations. That's all.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Karen. And you're absolutely right. I mean, I think there are two things going on. One is that the realization that you have just reiterated, that you will not solve it until you actually deal with every person who could be infected. That realization is constantly stated by global leaders, but they don't seem to have absorbed it because nothing they do reflects this understanding. And they are still very much in the old mold of protecting the large companies, giving them much greater power and control, pushing, as you mentioned, austerity measures that effectively privatize and financialize public services, including basic care services and health, adding insurance as yet another layer to basic healthcare rather than public provision of this, and continuing a hollowing out, which was already exposed in the pandemic. So unfortunately, that realization has not sunk in. And one reason I believe is that there isn't enough public pressure against this, except in a few countries. I think, I mean, it was absolutely correctly mentioned in the beginning that Rose talked about the US, and there is a pushback in the US. But in very few other countries is there sufficient public pressure, either for national changes with regard to care, public spending, protection of intellectual property rights, and how that is actually not just unjust, but stupid at a time like this, but also in terms of how their own governments are playing out internationally in this. So I think we definitely need a lot more public pressure. So that's one aspect, that for the powers that be, by which I mean the major important national governments and the major multilateral organizations, it's business as usual. They're going to carry on doing what they're doing, which is terrible, as we know. On the other hand, I think across many parts of the developing world, there will be a move towards deglobalization, if you like, only because the outcomes are so costly for them. Across Africa, there are moves now to create their own pharma companies and capacities. And they're going to do this. If the G7 doesn't provide the technology, they will get it from China, Russia, Cuba, wherever. And thank goodness they will. I believe that G7 is only going to react in doing anything progressive for fear of China. Therefore, I welcome all the internationalist moves that are being undertaken by any country, including China, that are actually providing alternatives. But I think that this very deep, I would say, betrayal of everybody else in the world and of basic solidarity by what has happened in this pandemic has really created a deep sense of mistrust and an unwillingness to rely anymore on these handouts and baskets of relief, which are, first of all, given in such a damaging way, like the IMF and kinds of debt relief that force you to raise VAT and other kinds of regressive taxes, that force you to charge more for user services, that cut public employment, or that are not given when you need it, like vaccines. So yes, we're going to get deglobalization. Now, this might even work for certain countries and certain places that, or regions that you will actually get local production of these. And I think all of that should be decentralized. But, for things like climate change, which is another big one, and which is actually going to affect the US as well, as we can see now from California and Oregon and et cetera, we can't do that. Once again, it is something that doesn't respect passports and visas and national borders. And so we somehow have got to get our act together globally. It's not happening. And I don't know what will make it happen except much, much more public pressure. There really isn't any at the moment. Even in the US, even among my progressive colleagues in a very progressive university in the northeast of the country, which is very progressive, I don't see it happening.
Thank you. I see Sigrid Quack has a question. Anybody else? Don't forget you have the possibility to raise your hand. Okay, Rose, I saw you. Okay, so we'll go with Sigrid and then Rose. Anybody else, just indicate that you want to ask a question.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, fine.
Good, because I was trying something with my headset and I wasn't sure whether everything is there. Thank you very much for these fantastic presentations. I think this is really a super excellent panel. I found it really very insightful and also different perspectives. I mean, I want to follow up what the topic was here, but maybe look at it slightly differently. I mean, I think we are going through a period where we have high uncertainty, and that will go on for at least 3-4 years, because I don't see that we have after the pandemic. It will be flaring up here and there, and it will be moving back and forth, and there will be new variants, etc. So, and when that has happened in previous pandemics, it could have been prevented if, to some extent, if we hadn't these large global inequalities that Jayati has been referring to. But I think this period of uncertainty sees also shifts in policy shifts. I mean, that some of you have been speaking about, that Rose has been speaking about in the US, that Ute has been referring to developments for health workers in Germany, that Nadia has been speaking as well to some extent. So how do we bring that together? You know, and I have to say, for my presidential lecture tomorrow, I have been really puzzling about this kind of return to a notion of autarky that Jayati has been criticizing in the approaches to vaccines and so on. It's not that I mean, I would say at the global level, I see also other developments than just a continuity of austerity. I see really different global organizations pulling money together, and particularly at the regional level to support, but it's obviously not enough. But I mean, you can phrase this in solidarity terms, but you can also phrase it in terms of self-interest. And I mean, I'm still puzzled with the extent that this vision that it's interconnected, and that, I mean, for reaching this, the goals you want to reach in developed countries, you have to look also at this other sphere. So I would also like to hear from Ute and Rose and Nadia from your perspective, what you think, why that is happening. I mean, why do we have this kind of enormous discrepancy of a shift towards new positive, progressive, if you want, policy agendas, and suddenly a kind of regression, I would even say, on international cooperation and support for developing countries?
Okay.
Thanks.
Who wants to go first? Rose?
Yeah, no, I thought, Sigrid, your question dovetails nicely with Jayati, is that right? Was
Yes,
saying,
thank you. That's right. Jayati. Yes.
Jayati, as well as
Sorry for mispronouncing.
as well as Karen. So this question, this question of globalization versus deglobalization, you know, in the 2008, my understanding of the 2008 crisis, in some ways, countries did best if they were deglobalized, right? If they were delinked from the US financial system, they didn't suffer as much, right? And so, you know, countries protecting their borders against the incursion of US stupidity and all of our games we played spilled over more into the open economies than into the more protective ones. At least that's my understanding, and I'm not an international expert. So Jayati, you can correct me. That's not the case though. Now in 2021, as you were saying, we have to be in the same boat to combat climate change and COVID. And so that that reality is present. What I have really focused on in this presentation is the fact that people are so hurting. You know, I mean, the racial injustice stuff in the US is so in your face day to day that people can't see beyond it. It's like I can't be thinking about the inequalities in the entire world when, you know, George Floyd has someone on his neck for 9 minutes, killing him. And so the immediacy of the crisis really does seem to pull people inward and then have them fight for things that they can make a difference in. And I think one of the real challenges for us is that people don't see how they can make it, even if they were thinking about people around the world, which in the US, we're very insular and we're not doing. It's like, how do I even begin to do that? And so I think that the movements that I was pointing to in the US are responding to the deep, this riveting inequality in the US. And people don't see how to make the connection to a broader global movement, even if they wanted to, but it's mainly not even in their horizon. That's my sense of the dilemma that we're seeing. There's this positive movement of people on the ground for the first time ever being out in the street. So that's amazing. Yet at the same time, as you're pointing out, the inequalities and the impact of COVID on people of color and women have been absolutely disastrous. So I'll leave it at that.
Uta and Nadia, you were, okay, Nadia, go ahead.
I think that this is a really difficult and complex question, but I was wondering, we had the experience of HIV, and it was interesting when we compare how our countries behaved, and my country behaved on this blocking the patents for HIV, and now for COVID. What happened? What changed internationally that allowed so different ways of acting? I think in a certain extent, I agree with Rose. There is a sort of combination between national, internal, immediate challenges and international challenges. And this sometimes make it possible to be progressive. And I think this was the case in HIV crisis. And sometimes it makes us to be much more regressive. And I would add one point to, and this became interesting because I also agree with Jayati when she says we need public pressure. If we don't have public pressure, probably we won't get there. While she was suggesting the argument, I was thinking again about Brazil because we had this incredible amount of death, the expansion of the contamination, and no action from the presidency, and the perfect alliance with the US, Trump US, and people at home. What we did by 8 o'clock or at each time the president, we didn't applaud really so enthusiastically the nurses, but we refused the president backing in the everything we had, cuts and everything every time we went to the TV. But at home, what is the interesting move recently? People said, we have to go out because most poor people have to be out working. They have no conditions to be at home confined. They never had. And we have been inside our house, protecting ourselves while the situation is deterioration. The Rose suggestion on the combination of internal and external issues. So ask for vaccine became a unifier of different types of possible pressures. So Black people, left-wing people, gay people, right-wing people, everyone went to the streets asking for vaccine. Today, we are going again to the streets, but not only asking to vaccine, but asking to get out with the president, impeaching the president. It's interesting how public pressure is moving and reconnecting things that had been not connected or even naturalized. It's natural we stay at home. Why protest? How can we protest? It's natural that Black people is more contaminated overall, they don't stay at home. They go out all the time. They are horrible. They don't agree with science. You know, we have to broke with this naturalized way of thinking about inequalities, inefficiency of the state, etc. But I totally agree with Rose. Internal, local, conjunctural aspects can be very important to go forward or backward.
Rita?
Well, I think one of my messages would also be, or my considerations would also be that public pressure can have an impact. So but it depends, of course, of the political constellation. The example I talked about was the new law concerning the pay in the care sector. I could have talked about two other positive developments, like new regulations for the meat industry in Germany, where the protest against where the pandemic made the terrible conditions in the meat industry visible. And this helped the minister to implement better regulations there. And a third example would be the supply chain law act that has been passed recently. But as I said, it's a question of where do people protest, where is open protest, and how is the political constellations. In this case, it was the Social Democrats in the government, and it helped them to implement some positive laws, so to speak. As far as international questions of international solidarity are concerned, I would totally agree to what Jayati said, that I see no progress. On the contrary, there was no protest towards more that help politicians to improve international solidarity, maybe on the contrary. And I don't see real progress there, because many people concentrated very much on their own problems, on internal problems, and this was more important for them in the pandemic than international global solidarity. So I'm quite, when it comes to this part of the developments, I'm more pessimistic.
Rose, did you have another question, or was that integrated into what you said? Okay. I don't see anybody else. If anybody has questions, just indicate. Otherwise, maybe I would, okay, go ahead, Karen.
You haven't asked a question yet, Dion, so
Yes.
please you go ahead and then I can go after you.
Okay. Yeah, well, I was thinking, I really, I'm interested in the care issue. And in Canada now, there's an initiative that's going forward in terms of precisely saying, okay, these people were there when we needed them and we did applaud them. Now, what's happening, it doesn't seem that so much is happening. In Quebec, a lot of nurses are of Haitian descent, and there's part of Montreal Nord, which did have a lot of difficulties during the pandemic. And precisely, sometimes the discourse was, yes, they have to go out. Well, they have to go out because they're working. They're working for us. So I'd like to hear you maybe on this issue of care, poverty. We also found gender gaps increasing. Also, we found that clearly low-wage earners were much more hardly hit by this pandemic. And there were a lot of issues in old care, care homes for old people, elderly people. So I'd like maybe to hear you a little bit more on this issue of care, poverty. I think Nadia mentioned circuits of care provision on an international perspective. So how do you think this is going to turn out? Because yes, over the last years, we did discuss care issues a lot. And obviously the pandemic put this forward. How this issue of care was really a huge issue in all countries. So maybe I'd like to hear you on this issue in the different countries precisely. And Nadia, I know that you mentioned that.
Can I go?
Yeah, go ahead.
No, it's a challenge. It's a really challenging issue. I was taking some notes. From one side, we have been observing an increasing amount of statistics documenting this different gaps. not only the gender gap, but it is an impressive gap that has been created in the Brazilian case related to elderly people, because this move toward inactivity, which is overall a women's movement, at least as we view, as we observe, it's also a move for elderly people. And in my country, elderly people used to work longer than they should or they must. And besides, from the social policies coming from Lula's government, they were very important family providers because they had some complement related to the condition of being elder and poor or elder and disabled, etc. So when elder people come out from the labor market and we have a pressure from the government to shrink this kind of public benefits, there is an important shrink of resources in the families. So we have to take family point of view too, because it's very important, especially in very poor countries where we have a combination of different providers. So not only between individuals there is a gap, but there is a gap between families, and there is a gap increasing between generations, touching the elders, and young people too have been moving toward inactivity. So I think this is quite important, and is related with the issue of workers and rights, because since there is no protection, I was hearing youth. It was marvelous to think on this regulation and collective agreement. If you think from a country where there is no right at all for care workers, if they don't recognize themselves as domestic employees, they won't have any right, because the only right they have if they recognize themselves as domestic employees, because the domestic employees got some rights in 2015. So it's quite difficult to think about this. And even when you take nursery personnel, one thing are nurses, other are the technical, other are the auxiliaries. As far as we go down in the hierarchy, conditions decrease very badly. Racial composition changes. In the top, they are white. In the base, they are black. In the top, they are the large cities. In the base, they are internal migrants. So it's a sort of permanent reproductions of gaps and inequality. And they all became visible, but if you don't have pressure, if you don't have organization, and if you have public policies that are very weak, we have to be pessimists.
Anyone else want to comment? Yes, Jayati?
Yes, thank you. I actually just want to add to what Nadia said. You know, in India, it's not just private care workers who are mistreated and inadequately recognized and under-remunerated. It's public care workers. So we actually have public health systems that operate on women who are not even called workers, because then they would have to be paid the minimum wages. They are called volunteers, and they're given what is called an honorarium, which is usually something like 1/4 to 1/3 of the minimum wage. And so this will give you some idea. They are local women. And so there's this whole notion that care work is not skilled work, that anybody can do it. And that extends from, you know, domestic private care to public care. So exactly as Nadia said, you go from the top most professional doctors, nurses, etc., down the line till you get to these auxiliaries and volunteers who do not have any workers' rights and who don't even, as I mentioned, get the minimum wage. They have been the frontline workers throughout this pandemic. Yes, we also did all these nonsensical things like banging pots and lighting candles to show our appreciation, but it stopped there. Most of them didn't get physical protection, protective equipment. Most of them did not even get proper health insurance. Most of them didn't get any kind of assistance during this pandemic. But a broader problem is that now across the developing world, the pandemic has led to such employment losses that the labor market conditions are even worse. And as long as you keep thinking of a whole range of care activities as relatively less skilled, And as long as the labor market gets worse and worse, it's not going to get better. In other words, without very, very major social movements that recognize the value of care and how important it is, the economic context in which care work is going to get rewarded has worsened for care workers. It's not got better. So I just want to, I'm sorry to give continuous bad news, but there it is. I just want to come back. I want to come back on one point that was made in the previous thing about, this, why isn't there more public pressure? And I really do believe that a large part of it has to do with the fact that people just don't know. I'm serious. I mean, now that I'm in the US, I used to think Indian media is bad, and possibly Indian mainstream media is the worst because it's completely the slave of the ruling government. Okay, so that's a problem. But here, none of the progressive media that I see actually highlights these issues. And I am convinced that the average person in the United States would recognize that, yes, a taxation deal would benefit citizens in the US. There would be more money for basic public services. There would be less need to tax ordinary people. But they don't know about this. It's not put out there. I'm convinced that the average US citizen would say there's no need to hoard a whole bunch of vaccines that you will never use, millions and millions of them. But they don't know about this. Most of my colleagues don't know about this. So what I'm saying is that there is a real lack of knowledge about what is happening, driven by mainstream media. So maybe that's where we need to focus. I don't think that people are so, I mean, it's not just being caught up in your own problem, but it's broader than that. It is that you're not even aware that these are relatively simple things that could be done that would benefit everybody, and they're not being done because business interests are able to control the decisions.
Mm-hmm. I'm being reminded that we have 2 minutes, and now I have 3 hands up. Rose, Ute, and one is disappeared.
I'll just say very quickly.
No, go ahead.
The care situation in the US is absolutely atrocious, abysmal. Workers have, there's lip service and there's no real, I mean, we don't even have paid sick leave in the United States. So go figure, right? So, I mean, we're starting from such a low base. There are a few pockets of domestic workers, the Domestic Workers United is a great organization, but it's just abysmal. And it's gotten worse in the pandemic, not better.
Ute, on this quickly?
Yeah, I only wanted to add that, of course, we have in Western European countries a very ambivalent development. For example, in Germany, we had a very good collective agreement about care for care workers last December in the public sector with 10% increase of wages within 2 years, which is far above average. And this was due to the pressure out of Corona, of COVID, of the pandemic. But at the same time, all the lockdowns internationally, of course, cut off all the international care change, which made it impossible for carers from Eastern Europe or even Far East to come to Western European countries, and which really, they all lost their source of income. So they have, of course, suffered a lot.